Raphaël will tell us, I think, about one of the most important, really theoretical questions about neural networks, which is how on earth can what looks like a propositional system do variable binding?
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. First of all, I want to thank all the organizers of this fantastic workshop. It's been a blast so far. And what I want to, I saw the scope of the workshop, talking about how LLMs relate to cognitive science, to psychology, linguistics, and neuroscience. And I thought this interest of mine for variable binding and the project I will be talking about is right at the intersection between all of these different things. So what I will do is that I will first give some background about why this is an interesting and important question. And then I will present the preliminary result of an experiment. So Mike, in his talk a few days ago, said that a few months in real time is like years in AI research. So what I will do here is I will take you back to ancient history, maybe prehistory, and talk about old debates about connectionism. So back in the old days, which is the late 80s, there was this ongoing debate between, on the one side, people like Jerry Fodor, classicists, about cognition, who put forward this objection to connectionist models of cognition using neural networks. So the objection was in the form of a dilemma. The first horn of the dilemma is either connectionist models lack the kind of structured representations and structured sensitive processes to account for the systematicity of cognition, or second hand of the dilemma, they do incorporate these, but in this case, they merely implement a classical symbol processing architecture, in which case they have no explanatory value for psychology, for cognitive science. They're merely models of implementation. And to that, connectionists like Paul Smolensky responded, there is a third way, right? It is possible that neural networks could have the requisite structure that would let them account for these structure-sensitive properties of cognition without merely implementing a classical architecture. So the debate is quite sprawling and complicated. I'm very interested in these questions, but here I want to focus on one specific aspect, which is actually something that both Smolensky and Fodor agreed on as a kind of minimal explanatory target, which is that any adequate model, no matter how it's implemented, must provide a viable mechanism for variable binding, because variable binding is a core mechanism in computation and cognition. So what is variable binding? It's a little tricky to give a general definition of variable binding that isn't related to specific implementations or specific domains, but I'll try my best. So variable, we can think of a variable, right, as a placeholder that can stand for different possible values within a specific domain, like slots that can be filled by fillers of values. And the crucial point is that they don't have a fixed meaning, right, on their own. So their meaning is derived from their context and how they're bound. And so if we think of it like this, we can define variable binding as the process of associating a variable, we could also say a placeholder or a role, with a specific value, specific instance, specific filler, within a structured representation, such that the value can be dynamically updated and retrieved for use in downstream computations. So I'm purposefully here thinking of variable binding as a computational mechanism. So variable binding, so construed, is pervasive and fundamental to language, linguistic processing, cognition as a whole, and even potentially perception. So let me go through this quickly. This will be familiar with this audience. So in linguistics, if you think about syntactic structure, right, variables and variable binding is omnipresent. So you can think of pronouns as variables, and in something like pronoun resolution, you have to resolve the reference of a pronoun that involves a form of variable binding to resolve the coreference. Quantification also involves introduction of variables within a certain quantified scope that get bound to a certain reference. WH movement is another example where you have a trace that acts as a variable. So lots of examples in syntactic theory. And beyond pure syntactic structure, so if you think of a sentence like the cat chases the mouse is chased by the cat, the parse tree is different, right? But the logical form is the same. So if you think of compositional semantics, how you parse that sentence to understand its meaning by taking the meaning of the parts, the syntactic structure, and put it all together, you're going to also have to parse its logical form that involves variables. And if you think of thematic rule, there's sprawling literature on that. But both the active and the passive form here have also the same analysis in terms of thematic roles, where there is an agent, and cat is bound to the role of agent, is filling the role of agent, and there is a patient or theme, and mouse is filling the role of the patient in that event. Okay. So in cognition as a whole, you could say variable binding is the cognitive glue that allows us to represent relationships dynamically. And that's very important because that goes a long way towards explaining the systematicity of cognition and our capacity to generalize compositionally, because variable binding lets us treat elements as slots in a structure and lets us recombine elements, whether it's words in language or concepts in thought, into novel structures. So it's not just about language, it's also about how we build up thoughts from parts. And so without that binding operation, cognition would be rigid and memorization based. So if you can think of this classic example of systematicity, if you can think a thought like John gives Mary a book, then you automatically can also grasp the thought Mary gives John a book, because you can, in both cases, you're binding the role of giver and receiver, or the role of agent and patient, to different values, but the role remains the same. So that's key to rule-based learning. Rules require abstraction, and variable binding allows us to learn abstract rules that can be applied flexibly across contexts without tying the rules to specific instances of the rule, which is critical for transferring knowledge, for example. If you think of mathematical, logical, social reasoning, these all depends in some sense on roles, like the role of cause, or the role of sum or leader. And that stays constant even if the entities filling them change. So again, variable binding lets us reason about these roles across particular instantiations. It's also key to analytical reasoning. Analytical reasoning doesn't merely rely on computation of similarity, but also on structural alignment between a source domain and a target domain. And that also involves mapping relationships in a way that involves variable binding. So I actually have this other project I'm not going to talk about today on how language models perform analogical inference with kind of structure mapping process like that. But if you're interested, I can point you to it in later. And finally, it's important to how we understand events, right? Events are structured. They involve agents acting on objects in time and space, and variable binding helps us parse events. Okay, finally, in perception, this is a little bit more controversial, but there are a number of vision scientists, for example, who think that variable binding is also important in visual processing. So, for example, there is an interesting literature on object files. An object file is a mental representation in visual short-term memory that sustains reference to an external object over time and stores and can also update information about these objects' properties or features like shape, color, etc., through symbols that are organized into category-specific memory slots. That's the thought. So you can track an object independently of its changing color or its changing shape, for example. And vice versa, you can perceive the shapes or colors of objects independently of the particular objects that are associated with them. And there's also this literature on relations, abstract relations. So there are some results suggesting that the visual system automatically represents abstract relations like containment or support in that case, being on something, independently from the specific objects involved. So how does that work? If it's so important, it's a core explanatory target of cognitive science. How does that work? Well, in a classical architecture, the kind of architecture favored by people like Jerry Fodor, and nowadays people like Jake Quilty-Dunn or Rick Mandelbaum, the basic operation to combine representations can be thought of as an operation of concatenation. So you have atomic discrete representations that can be combined into complex representations by co-tokening the simple representations into a structured complex representation that involves or can involve binding variables to values. This is a basic example with a two-place relation. And the challenge for connectionist models is that how do we do that with a neural network? How do we do that with vector-based representations? It's highly non-trivial, right? So if we think about this in very basic terms, suppose you have two vectors in a two-dimensional space. How do you combine these two vectors in a structured way? I mean, you could take the average of these two vectors, but that's not going to be structured. It's not going to have the relevant kind of structure, certainly not the kind of structure on the face of it that could support something like variable binding. And specifically in the classical camp, there is this analogy between the mind and a classical computer architecture, like a von Neumann architecture, where the idea is variable binding is supported by an addressing mechanism. So in a classical von Neumann architecture, you have a separation between processor and memory, right? Such that you can store in memory slots, memory addresses, some bits of information. And what you can do is you can not only have direct addressing when you have some value stored in a specific address location, but you can also have indirect addressing with a pointer, where you have two addresses. So you have a first address that serves as a symbol for the variable, and that address is pointing to the location containing the address of the value at a different memory address. So the actual value in this indirect addressing mechanism is specified by the bit pattern at the second address, which is indirectly accessed. And that's a mechanism for variable binding because it means that you can bind the value to a variable and compute over variables without accessing the value directly. So it's computationally efficient. And if you need to access the value of a variable, then you can do a dereferencing operation that involves finding, retrieving through indirection the value associated with the pointer. Okay. Now, when it comes to modern deep neural networks, is there anything like that? So here's a quote, or a couple of quotes from this Target BBS paper by Jake Quilty-Dunn and colleagues that was defending the language of thought, a classical architecture, like a neo-Fodorian stance on cognition, made quite a big splash. There were lots of interesting commentaries on that Target paper. And they say that variable binding is a classic example of a language of thought like symbolic computation. And they also talk about deep neural networks, and they say it remains open that DNNs might mimic the performance of biological perception, so achieve the right kind of behavior, human-like behavior, and cognition across a wide variety of domains and tasks by implementing the core features of language of thoughts. So they fall slightly short of endorsing the dichotomous dilemma that Fodor and Pilichin addressed to connectionists, because they say it remains open, so they don't say like this necessarily follows. If neural networks behave compositionally in a human-like way, they will necessarily implement a classical architecture. But they say that's quite likely, and specifically if they implement a mechanism for variable binding. That's the classic example of a lot like symbolic computation. So for today, I want to ask two questions. I'm personally very interested in the general question of whether you can have a neural network that accounts for the structure-sensitive properties of cognition in a non-classical way without implementing all the hallmarks of a language of thought architecture. But for today, this is a bit of a moving target because what counts as the hallmark of a language of thought architecture is a bit of a moving target. I want to focus specifically on variable binding. So I have two questions. I have a behavioral question and I have a mechanistic question. Given the progress of neural networks, right, we're no longer in the 80s, we now have, as we've talked about, language models and transformer-based neural networks that do remarkable things, including behavior that is remarkably systematic in some cases. So the first behavioral question, can transformers behave consistently with the hypothesis that they have a mechanism for variable banding? And then I have a further mechanistic question. If so, how does this mechanism for variable banding actually work, and how does it emerge during the course of training? So these are the questions I want to focus on today. So let me first give you an aside on compositional generalization. We talked about this already a little bit in Brendan and Naomi's talks. So there is a problem with big pre-trained LLMs, which is that they are pre-trained on basically everything, right? So the big pre-trained on virtually any commonly occurring syntactic construction and any possible topic, etc. And that makes it difficult to assess how they generalize from a training distribution to out of distribution set. So if your goal is to assess whether a neural network can generalize compositionally, meaning by recombining elements that have been seen in the training data in ways that haven't been seen before, such that they can parse complex expressions based on the constituent elements as well as the structure of the complex expression. The best way to do this is to use a synthetic data setup, where you train a model from scratch, or in some cases fine-tune it on a synthetic data set that is designed in such a way that the only way to achieve good performance on the test set is to generalize compositionally. So there are a number of these data sets. Let me give you one example from the scan data set from Brendan's work. This is just an illustrative train test split. The idea is that you have, it's a sequence-to-sequence learning task. You have on the left-hand side an input, some instructions, like action instructions, that need to be turned into a sequence of actions. So if the instruction is jump, you need to produce the action jump. If it's turn left, you need to produce the action L turn. If it's turn left twice, you need to produce the action L turn, L turn. And the point is that in the test set, you have some combinations in the input that haven't been seen before. So you need to compose these functions in ways with elements that you haven't encountered before, and there are different ways to set up the split between the train and test set here. Okay. So interestingly, initial performance on these benchmarks with transformers was somewhat underwhelming, but it has dramatically improved since. There's also a sprawling literature on that. You can see some of these improvements here. This is not even updated. I mean, I just copied this from a talk I gave a couple of years ago, so you would have even higher performance these days. But it's a bit of a complicated story. So what helps? Well, the evidence that emerged that there are three main things that help a lot. One is you can set up the data mixture, training data mixture in a way that helps. You can do data annotation. There's also evidence that if you pre-train your model on code and then fine-tune it on the synthetic benchmark, that helps. Of course, you could say that's cheating because then it's not just trained from scratch. There is a lot of evidence that the learning strategy helps. So Brandon mentioned his Nature paper with Baroni, where they use meta-learning to achieve essentially virtually perfect human-like generalization. You can also, as Naomi mentioned, do overtraining. Namely, if you keep training long past the point where the model gets good performance in the training set, you get this kind of grokking, quote-unquote, phenomenon where suddenly you get generalization much later. And architectural tricks, so the details like the specific encoding, positional encoding scheme you pick, it matters. The depth of the network matters. We have evidence and all of that stuff. But the point is that it is possible, the devil is in the details, but it is possible to have a setup where a transformer model trained from scratch on this kind of synthetic task generalizes basically perfectly.
So when talking about a
assessing compositional generalization, one of the things that comes to mind for me is there's a couple papers that look at asking models to like combine many different skills or many different categories of things, and just by the nature of the combinatorial explosion of like when you ask it, when you have a like very large set of things that you're combining multiplicatively, and you then take a random subset of those, you can be pretty sure that none of that was in the training data. So I'm wondering how that compares to these like synthetic tasks, because it seems like it might be preferable because you're assessing actual language models as opposed to like things trained from scratch on synthetic things.
Right.
And you're able to assess a similar notion of like, are they really doing some kind of compositional generalization?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So it depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to probe the in-principle capacities and limitations of neural networks and the transformer architecture, then the synthetic setup is actually, I think, preferable. If you want to have to say something that is directly relevant to large pre-trained models, and that kind of setup could be preferable, it's still hard, even in these cases, to fully ensure that there is no leakage, as it were, of the in-distribution training data. I mean, really, these models are trained on a lot of things, and it's a pervasive problem in evaluation, right? To rule that out. So I think it's still preferable to use a synthetic setup to have a clean experiment if your goal is not necessarily to directly assess these large pre-trained models. But yeah, that's something you could do. Okay, so there was a survey that came out, I think it was EMNLP recently. It's a survey on compositional behavior and compositional generalization. So interestingly enough, 5 of the speakers of this workshop were surveyed, including myself. And this is a PCA plot they have in the paper that just shows the 2 main principal components based on answers. And then they gave some labels for the axis, but these are a little tentative, I would say. You get a slightly weird clustering here. I mean, this is the clustering based on hierarchical clustering in the high dimensional space. So I end up in the same, having the same kind of default view, as they call it, as Emmanuel and Brendan. And then Jacob and Naomi are in a different, in different clusters. It looks like I'm saying here, well, current evaluations suffices for assessing whether models can behave compositionally. To some extent, I'm not quite at 10, right? So like, it's not quite completely sufficient, but it's pretty good. And I'm saying we don't need interpretability. The reason for that is just because the question they asked was about compositional behavior. So if your question is about behavior, then I don't think you need to like do interpretability for behavior. And I think they know, obviously, like this is from Paul Smolansky's group. They know that. So this is not a dig at the paper. It's a great paper. Actually, I think it's just the nature of the PCA that kind of loses a lot of information, just to flag that. Okay. But my point is that I actually think if you want to go from behavior to an understanding of what's happening under the hood, it's important to try to interpret the computations that underlie the causal structure of the network. Not everyone thinks this way. I actually had this discussion with Brendan a couple of days ago, where he seems he's less interested in the mechanistic side of the story as he is in the behavioral side of the story. So for him, it was enough to demonstrate that a transformer trained in the right way could achieve human-like compositional generalization. I'm personally very much interested in the mechanistic side of the story as well. And part of the reason for that is, again, like if you think of these old debates between connectionist and classical symbolic models of cognition, the implementation matters a lot. And specifically if you want to understand how variable banding or whether variable banding features in the mechanism that accounts for compositional generalization, that matters a lot. Okay. So now shifting from pure behavioral analysis to a developmental and mechanistic perspective on variable binding in transformers. So first I want to mention some related work from Jacob, actually, Jacob's group, where they look at entity binding in pre-trained LLMs like Llama. And basically the idea is that if you have an input like Alice lives in Laos, Bob lives in Peru, and then you ask where does Alice live, the network must have some way of tracking or which feature in this case the place where people live is bound to which individual. So to keep track of discourse entities, there needs to be some kind of mechanism there. Presumably, there are different ways you could do this. What they find is that at least in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, you can identify a subspace in activation space that they call the binding ID subspace, where the entity and the feature that go together are both tagged with the same binding ID, which is just a vector. It's kind of like an abstract tag, such that if there is high similarity in that subspace between one token and another, they're bound together in this way. So that's something that hints at a variable binding mechanism in transformers in large pre-trained models. But it doesn't quite give us a computational story, right? It tells us there are some subspaces that look like they're achieving that role, and you can intervene on them. But it doesn't give us a whole computational story. It also doesn't give us a developmental story. So now I'm going to present for the rest of this talk some work with a former student of mine, Yiwei Wu, and Atticus Geiger, trying to understand how transformers learn a variable binding. So here is what we did. We trained a small transformer model on a synthetic variable binding and dereferencing task. I will present the task in a second. There is a behavioral component of the experiment, which is to assess performance of the model on a held-out test set and how it evolves over the course of training. So importantly, one of the key aspects of our experiment is that we take this developmental perspective where we save training checkpoints and we investigate how performance changes over the course of training. And there is an interpretability component where we use probing and causal interventions to understand the strategy that the model learns and how it learns it. So here's the task. I first will give you a toy version of the task and then what our real inputs actually look like. So the idea is that you have these little programs with the Python-like syntax that consist in a series of variable assignments and a final dereferencing step at the end. So the final line is querying the value of a variable. So you have these special tokens that we introduce in our vocabulary, the hash token and the colon token, and in the middle you have a variable name, and you have to give as the output the value of that variable based on the variable chain. Now, the series of assignments you have before will include a variable chain related to the query variable. In this case, this is what we call a 3-hop program because you have a chain with a depth of 3. You have 3 variable assignments before the query of the variable. And you also have a distractor chain here. So you can actually represent that as a directed graph, right? Where we have here the queried chain from the queried variable all the way to its value, and then we have these distractor assignments, including one that is branching with the main query chain and a distractor chain that is independent. That was a short program. Here is actually what our inputs look like. So there are 17-line programs, so much longer. And the depth of the query chain can go from 1 to 4. So you can have up to 4 variable assignments in the query chain. So again, here is the query. Here are the 4 hops of this query chain. And here are the distractors. And here is what the graph would look like for this particular program. Okay, so that's the task is just to dereference the variable audience. It's a task that involves tracking assignments relevant to the query and dereferencing the queried variable. Yeah.
How do you ensure that it doesn't use like some shallow heuristic to do it? Like it just looked at, in this case, the first number.
Yeah, I will come to that. Yeah. So the short answer is that, well, I will talk about the sampling. So let me just talk about this. So we sample 500,000 programs. We found a split in this data. So we have 26 variable names, which are all lowercase letters in the alphabet, and 10 constants, which are just digits from 0 to 9. The sampling strategy favors longer chains, but we also use rejection sampling to balance the data across 4 possible referential depths for the query variable chain. So this effectively ensures that you will have many programs where the correct answer doesn't appear on the first line, or for that matter, the second or third line. But your question is relevant to what the model learns, so we'll come back to that later. The model itself is a GPT-2-like transformer architecture with 12 layers and 8 attention heads per layer. We use rotary positional encoding. Yeah, that's basically it. So what does the performance look like? Here is the performance on the test set, and I put dashed lines where we see some nonlinear transition phases. We have 2 nonlinear transition phases where we see rapid increase in test set accuracy. And at the end of training, so we trained for a little over 105,000 steps, the final checkpoint accuracy is 99.97%. So out of 49,000 test set programs, there are only 16 errors. So I think it's fair to say that this is near perfect accuracy, and the model has essentially solved the task. So from a behavioral perspective, that was our first question, right? Can a transformer behave consistently with the hypothesis that it's learned mechanism for variable binding? Well, that seems to give a positive answer to that question. Here is, yeah.
Is that the validation accuracy you're showing?
That's the test set accuracy. So held out. Here are 200 randomly sampled programs from the test set where I plotted the whether each checkpoint gets it correct or not. These are training steps. And you can see if you take just random programs like that, you can still see the 3 phases. The previous plot had a log x-axis. This is linear, so it's a bit more compressed, but you can see 3 phases. Where like at the beginning it's wrong for almost everything, then it gets like some programs correct, and then it generalizes. Looking at programs in different at different depths, here's something really interesting that's happening. So in the middle phase, the model shoots up to high accuracy on 4-hop programs that have 4 hops to dereference the query, and much lower performance as you decrease the number of hops in the program. The plot thickens. This is the prediction of distribution of different digits in the model predictions. So that's quite a cool plot, I think, because you can really see that in the first phase is just basically overfitting to predicting specific constants. And then in the middle phase, it still is not quite balanced. I should say that the sampling procedure was such that it's balanced across, basically balanced across predictions. There are as many programs whose correct answer is 1 as programs whose correct answer is 2, 3, etc. And you can see at the end, it reaches that balance in the predictions. And now if we look at where the correct answer appears in the programs, now we're starting to understand what's going on a bit better. So you can see in the middle phase, it's starting to get really, really high accuracy, around 90% on programs whose answer occurs in the first line. Going back to your question earlier. And also higher accuracy, but still not as high on programs whose answer occurs on the second line, and basically very low accuracy on everything else. Okay, so what do we make of this? Well, here's how we interpret these three phases of training. The phase one involves learning only one thing. The model learns that it has to predict constants, like numbers. But it predicts essentially random constants. So it learns that it can't predict like variable names or special tokens like the hash token. It has to predict number tokens. That's all it learns. In the second phase, it learns a bag of heuristics that relate to early assignments in the first line and second line in particular. The strongest heuristic is the first line assignment. And that's just because when you have deeper chains for the queried variable, there is a higher likelihood that the correct answer is going to be on the first line. So in fact, we have a little over half of our test set program where the correct answer is on the first line. So the model latches onto that and learns this heuristic that it can just predict, in lots of cases, the constant on the first line, and it will get the correct answer. And that's how it gets to about 56% accuracy on the test set. And then finally, we have this grokking-like transition in the final phase where it learns a systematic solution to the task. So these are the behavioral results. Now we want to know how it's doing that. So we started with some probing experiments on the new line token at the end of each line. We're wondering whether the model maintains some kind of internal representation of program states at each line. So like representation of assignments so far at each line. So we did this with linear probes, and essentially the results were very poor. So even the best performing layer in layer 6 only achieved about 31% accuracy at the variable level, so tracking the values of variables that have been assigned, excluding unassigned variables, and only about 9% accuracy to track the full program state. So that suggests the model finds a more sophisticated mechanism to solve the task. It's not just storing the whole program state. So that's where we turn to causal interventions. Yeah.
Can you just say, on the previous slide, like the 8.9%, how did you decode that?
So we trained a linear probe on the activations of each layer, and we tried to recover a tensor representing all viable value bindings in the program.
You trained a different model for each variable, or?
No, we want to recover the full tensor that's viable value bindings. And we do this including, like for the whole program state, or excluding variables that haven't been assigned.
Okay, so you learned a function that went from the observed activation to that vector assignments.
To the state of the probe. So like to a tensor that contains viable value bindings. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So causal interventions. So we use interchange intervention, so some of the activation, patching, causal tracing, and the mechanistic interpretability literature. So what does that entail? The idea is that you have an original input that you can run on your program, like that program, for example, and then you can design a counterfactual input, where in this case we change the value of the root of the queried variable chain. So that should change the behavior of the program. We pick programs that the model gets correctly, by the way. So here the value of O has changed, and the behavior should change accordingly. So how do then we proceed? We can sample an original input, create the counterfactual input, as I said, and then we can cache the model activations on the counterfactual input, and we can swap the activations of specific model components, for example, activations in a layer, on the original input with a cached activation from the counterfactual input. And then we looked at the effect on logits and on behavior. And if we can recover the behavior of the counterfactual input by swapping in some activations in the original input, for example, making the program predict 8 instead of 3, that tells us, presumably, that whatever we patched in, that component had a causal influence on behavior. So something that some information that's encoded in that component that's relevant to solving the task. That's essentially the idea. Okay, so first we did an experiment where we patched the residual stream at each layer. So let me just give you a quick primer on what that means in a transformer. So if you think of our transformer, we have 12 layers, 8 attention heads per layer. There's an MLP layer as well. We patched here. So we patched at the input of the residual stream for each token position. So each token position has this thing called the residual stream at each layer, where you can think of what attention heads, multi-head, parallel attention heads are doing is just doing some operation and then putting them back into, concatenating them into the residual stream. Then you have MLP, back to the residual stream, and then you repeat this for 12 transformer blocks. So importantly, you have a residual stream at each token position. So if you think of our programs, you have a token position m equals 3, etc. For a given program, 17-line program, you can have 67 token positions. Each of them has its own residual stream. And one important conceptual point about transformers is that one of the reasons they work so well is that they can route information dynamically across token positions and across layers. So what attention heads do is that they can read and write information, read information from earlier layers, from the other layer, from token positions at the current token or previous token in the sequence, and move that information to the residual stream of the current token. Okay. So what we do for this first experiment, we do activation patching on the inputs of the residual stream at each layer. So here is an example for a single program of a result. And we were quite excited when we first got the result because it's extremely clean, as you can see. So essentially, it's a bit, these are all the tokens. It's a bit hard to see, I guess, but these are the relevant assignments. So it's a depth 3 or 3-hop program. Here are the assignments at different depths, and you can see that there's something happening on the right-hand side of these assignments at these key tokens. And specifically, essentially what that shows you is how the information moves across layers. So the y-axis is layers, and it shows you how the model is internally propagating assignments to dereference the query variable. So it's patching, so we've patched in here in the counterfactual input b equals 3, right? And you can see that patching b equals 3 affects the behavior at the depth 1 position in early layers. Then you have this evidence that it's propagating the information to the depth 2 position at later layer, then propagating at depth 3, and then propagating at the query token position, and finally at the column. Yeah?
Just to clarify, the darker blue means that if you patch there, then you get the counterfactual behavior at the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's for a single program. Obviously, we want an aggregate measure across programs. Yeah.
So all this whole thing is the counterfactual b equals 3.
Yeah, this whole thing. So even though you see some white here, this is a heat map. So like, it looks very clean, and it looks like we only patched at this position. We patch everywhere here, and there's no effect at all of these positions in all layers except for the tiles that are in blue.
But you're not doing the counterfactual of like q equals 3. That's only because you did b equals 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is what it tells you about information movement. Yeah. Then to aggregate across programs, what we do, because of course these assignments occur at different lines in different programs, is that we aggregate by focusing on meaningful token positions, such that the right-hand side of depth 1 assignment, right-hand side of depth 2 assignments, depth 3, depth 4 if there is one, and then query variable and column position. That's how we aggregate across programs. So here is what we get when we split here across programs of different hops. And here, because we want to assess the effect of the heuristic, programs where the correct answer appears on line 1, program where the correct answer appears on line 2, and programs where the correct answer appears on another line. I will show you, I will zoom in on this. So starting with the programs where the correct answer appears not on line 1 or line 2, the programs where these early line 1, line 2 heuristics have no effect. Well, it's hard to see here. You can see it better on there. But you can see, including for the 4-hop program, the averaged patching effect quite nicely, where you can see propagation across the different depths. So this is the story of the general mechanism, or the first way to visualize general mechanism that is learned by the transformer to do the variable value test. Now, if you move to programs where the some kind of second line heuristic could be efficacious, again, hard to see because none of contrast here, but you basically lose that. You also some difference there, so you see some evidence of the expression of a second line heuristic, but not that strong. And then programs where the correct answer appears on the first line, very striking. By the way, this is all for the final checkpoint, right? What that tells us is that the early line heuristics are still there in the final checkpoint, because here you can see that when the correct answer occurs on the first line, the model can solve it by moving the information right away from the first to the second layer. It's directly at the final column position, ready to predict the answer. So that's interesting, because the received view in the grokking literature, as I had this little back and forth with Naomi, is that you get something like early heuristics or memorization phase, then you get a circuit formation for a general mechanism, and then you get removal of the early heuristic or memorized input-output mappings. Here, what we see instead, we have evidence that the mechanism builds on top of the early heuristics, and when the heuristic works, the mechanism doesn't kick in, the general mechanism, there's no need. When it doesn't work, then the mechanism that's implemented in later layers kicks in to increase the logits for the correct answer.
A couple questions. First, couldn't you have assessed whether or not the first line heuristic was kicking in by just having some additional examples where the first line heuristic gives you the wrong answer in a way that never showed up in the training set?
You mean having a value that's not the value of the query? Well, but you mean in that case that there would be the correct answer for the query wouldn't occur anywhere?
Well, it would occur in some other line.
Oh, but then it gets the right answer. So when I say the first line heuristic is still there, it doesn't mean that it gives you the wrong answer. It means it only kicks in when it gives you the correct answer. The program gets perfect. It gets 99.97% accuracy on the test set. So it's essentially perfect at the task. The point is that the heuristic is still causally efficacious, but only when it gets you the correct answer. It's almost like a kind of amortized inference.
Yeah, but then it's doing some assessment of when to apply the heuristic, which is the interesting part.
Yes, so exactly. So there is, internally what happens is that you have the heuristic that you can see it even there. If you look here, it will be easier to see. You can see the effect of the heuristic in increasing. It's easier to see this is for success rate, it's easier to see with logits. But the heuristic increases the logits regardless of the first line constant. But then the later mechanism increases the logit of the correct answer even more, should the correct answer appear somewhere else.
Yeah. Maybe this is, so you see this sort of first line heuristic because you're doing this in sort of increasing depth. So you start off with the actual values, and then you increase it. And maybe this isn't the way that you would program this in a computer. It would confuse a computer, but it wouldn't confuse a human if you said W equals K, K equals 2, what is W? Like if you put it outside of this order of the depth. Does that make sense?
W.
So if I said W equals K, K equals 2, what is W?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? A human would still be able to do this. Maybe if it becomes 4-hop, you'd need to write it down and look at it, but you'd still be able to do this sort of variable binding.
Yeah.
Or is that variable binding still?
Well, it just depends on the semantics of your program, right? In our program, this would not work because you would bind. Well, it depends if, we can maybe talk about this later, but you can have, in computer programming, you can have pass by value or pass by reference.
Yeah.
And so if you have something like pass by reference, then you could have something like this. The semantics we have for our program is pass by value, but that's something we looked into potentially training another model with a pass by reference semantics. But we can talk about it later. I'm just a little mindful of time, so if you are very brief.
Maybe it's quick. Did you try like a test set that's like out of distribution in terms of number of hops? Like the training is out of 3?
Yeah. I think we did. I can't remember, this is a long time ago. We get like high accuracy, but not as high, and it decreases with when you introduce more and more hops. Yeah. Okay, so the other patching experiment we did is on attention heads themselves. So here we patch on the output of attention heads. So as I said, attention heads route information selectively and dynamically across layers and token positions. And they do this, so if you think, the input to the residual stream, you'll have a certain embedding for a specific token, then attention heads do that thing, and then the embedding has shifted somehow. What's happening in the middle is that attention heads can read and write to subspaces of the main embedding space of the residual stream. And what's interesting about this is that the subspaces can essentially act like memory stores, like memory addresses in classical architecture if they're orthogonal to each other, if they don't interfere with each other. So here are the results of patching on attention heads. I'm only showing you layers where something interesting happens. And essentially, we see that there are some heads that are strongly specialized in moving information from specific depths, from one depth to the other, or from one token position to the other to propagate the value of the query variable. The reason why it's not always that clean is that in some layers you have several attention heads that work concurrently to do that. But you still can see that you have some attention heads that are highly specifically tuned to doing the information movement for the variable binding mechanism. And so we also wanted to develop some kind of metric to track the evolution of the emergence of a general mechanism and the emergence of heuristics across the course of training, because it's a developmental study. So we did this by tracking the evolution of patching success on the residual stream at key layer and token positions across training. So we identify some, think about this plot again. We identify at which layer, which token position something interesting is happening that discriminates between heuristics and the general mechanism. So we selected the final column position at layer 1. That's where the heuristic, the first line heuristic, is going to be expressed. Rep depth 1 at layer 6, rep depth 2 at layer 7, rep depth 2 and 3 at layer 8, rep depth 3 and 4 at layer 9. The query and the query token position at layer 8, and that's it. So what do we see? Well, here it's looking at programs where the answer is neither on the first nor the second line. And you can see, and it's split by the number of hops in the program. You can see clearly here the emergence of the general mechanism that appears here. Whereas the heuristic is suppressed for these particular categories of programs where the answer is neither on the first or the second line. Now, if you look at programs where the answer is on the first line, again, really strong evidence of what I was saying, that the first line heuristic remains causally efficacious to the end, doesn't go down, right, for these particular programs where the correct answer appears on the first line. And for where the correct answer appears on the second line is messier, you also see a difference from other programs, but this is consistent with our behavioral results. The second line heuristic is not as strong as the first line heuristic. Okay, so I don't have much time left. I just want to flag that one of the next steps for us is to understand subspaces and the full circuit. And here I have three main hypotheses. One is that there is something like a direct copy mechanism that doesn't involve anything like indirect addressing, where the program, the model, is storing, propagating the values of the queried variable in a dedicated subspace such that it can be copied all the way from at relevant token positions all the way to the final query variable position. So that would be a kind of direct addressing mechanism. But you could also have something like a positional pointer mechanism where you store in some subspace information about, using the positional encoding, about the position of the correct answer. And at the end, you have a dereferencing step, which works like indirect addressing, where you look up the value that's at that memory location, as it were. So that's something that would be most similar to indirect addressing. And you could also do that with this binding ID mechanism from Jacob's work that I mentioned. It's a little bit more complex. You need more attention heads, but that's also something that could be happening. So that's what we're currently trying to understand. And before I conclude, I just want to mention that we also introduced this platform called Variable Scope. So I designed this using, it's a React-based web app, essentially. And the idea is to, in the spirit of making mechanistic interpretability research more accessible and also more transparent and reproducible, essentially all of our analyses are available there in interactive format. So here's a quick demo. I'm not going to show everything, but this is anonymized for review, by the way, but you can still access this variablescope.org. So there's this program graph visualizer that I set up so that you can actually look at the graph and look at the chains, the variable chains for different programs. This is sampled from our test set. Then you can look at behavioral metrics. So for example, the heat map I showed, you have an interactive version of it for like 200 randomly sampled programs. There are also different ways you can set it up. For the training trajectory, you can look at various metrics, including those I mentioned. There we go. It's all interactive. And we have also, not all of them yet, but some of the interpretability intervention results. This is how the logits evolve across layer over time. And here is the results of attention head patching. And you can also look at patching experiments, not just for single heads, but for combinations of heads as well. Okay. And I'll close here. Thank you.
So, time for a few questions.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. This is extremely interesting. I'm curious what your hypothesis is for why that first line heuristic still exists at the end of training, because it seems like it's learned the more kind of generic algorithm that in principle should also work for the first line case. So yeah, so like why do you think that heuristic is invoked at all when the more general algorithm seems to exist?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that if the model doesn't have any strong pressure to remove the heuristic based on basically like continued training and regularization, then there's no incentive to remove it, then it doesn't have to remove it, right? So for the modular addition case, maybe I can, this is my appendices. There is, just keep this, okay. This kind of classic working example from the literature, right? So you have a pentameter modular addition, and you have three phases: memorization, circuit formation, and cleanup. The cleanup phase is what we don't have because we don't clean up the early heuristic. We build on top, well, the model builds on top of them. The reason for that is that the memorization phase here is just like memorizing input-output mappings from the training data. That's obviously going to interfere with the circuit. But what we have in our case is a circuit in later layers that doesn't interfere with the early line heuristics. It just corrects the answer when needed. So yeah, there could be lots of factors. Like Naomi talked about initialization, for example. Something we haven't done, but could be interesting to do experiments to figure out whether different randomly initialized models with different seeds generalize differently in terms of maybe like removing the heuristic or never generalizing to a general mechanism, although I doubt that would happen. So that's something we haven't done. But I think, yeah, basically the idea is that if there is no strong incentive to remove the heuristics, they just stay there. And in fact, yeah, thinking cognitively, maybe this is a bit of a treacherous analogy, but it's almost like amortized inference. When you don't need to do the full viable banding mechanism, you can get the right answer right away in just one layer. So why wouldn't you? Like, it's just like, if you're in your network and you're lazy, you just get the correct answer right away, and it's much simpler. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
This is really interesting. I don't know if this parallel is already made in the talking literature, but something I think of looking at that, there's a similarity with at least some evidence with how babies learn verbs. So like irregular verb forms, so the past tense of go is went, it's not goed. So babies will actually first memorize the irregular form, went, and then they'll overgeneralize, which you can think of as like the circuit formation step. And then you get to a point where like we know how to like say one or the other. So I just wonder if there's a if you can draw some, like if there's cognitive implications for this stuff, because it's not natural language you're working with, but
yeah.
like a similar kind of.
So regarding the implications for natural language, one thing we want to do as well is to see whether we find a similar mechanism in a pre-trained model, like Llama, for example, using the same task. The difference with your example, and I mean, there are a number of these analogies, but one of the differences is that here the mechanism, the general mechanism, will give you the right answer for all inputs. So, as we were saying earlier, you don't really need these early heuristics. I mean, you could remove that. Actually, one thing we want to do as well is ablation experiments, where we just try to remove the early line heuristics and see what we can get. So you don't need them. Whereas in this case, you need to learn exceptions to the rule, right? Here, the rule applies for every input.
Thanks so much for the talk. It was so awesome. The visuals are really, really cool. I have a question regarding maybe the compositionality of your findings. I'm wondering, do you think it would be at all feasible if you had found the sort of circuit for 2-hop problems and also for 3-hop problems, whether you could somehow compose them to do 5-hop problems?
Right, yes. So another thing we want to try is to copy a layer, duplicate a layer, and see whether we can generalize to 5-hop programs this way, based on our hypothesis about the mechanism.
Cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, Beno.
A bit more maybe out of the talk. Also fantastic talk, of course. I'm wondering if you thought about the case where you have to do the variable binding or these kind of reasoning across examples in training, not in one single example, where you have to keep the memory of in batch one or in a different batch their variables binded, and then in the next batch, because in the more realistic case with LLMs, they often learn across examples how to bind different variables maybe, and not in one single forward pass or one example. Do you know what?
Right. So can you clarify what you mean? So you
in one example you see A is B, and then in the next batch or in the next example you see B is K, and then over different examples you have to keep memory basically.
I'm trying to So if you think of language, if you have a variable like a pronoun, you need to. Are you saying, well, maybe the language model would see some sentences that doesn't have the reference of that pronoun, so you'll have the variable without the value that needs to fill it, and then in another batch there is the previous sentence that contains actually the reference, something like this.
Maybe with pronouns it's not the best example because that rarely happens, but maybe there's examples where through in different batches you have throughout the training kind of scattered.
So I feel like one example might be something that changes through time, like the president of the US. You observe some data in 2000 and you bind.
Yeah.
And then you observe in 2010,
Yeah. So yeah, you learn but that's more like learning abstract concepts. I mean, yeah, obviously, it relates to roles and role filter binding to some extent, but in a more complicated setup like here with multiple hop variable binding, where you have a specific computation you need to do. To learn this, you kind of need to have a program that makes sense during training and see the whole program, right? But yeah, can you learn abstract roles from the way they occur in different contexts, unbound or bound to particular values? For sure. Yeah.
So suppose that everything goes very well and you figure out this is due to a particular kind of sequential slots binding mechanism or something. Then what's then the takeaway? What do you do with that?
Yeah. So that's where it gets philosophically complicated if you want to go back to the connectionist classicist debates. So the question is, well, if we found something like this, for example, does that mean this is implementing a classical architecture with indirect addressing in some meaningful sense? I think that's a very, very interesting question. So that was my motivation initially starting to work on it. I think it will depend on what you build into the requirements for such implementation. In this case, what I think is really interesting is that you don't necessarily have what you have in a classical architecture, which is role filler independence, or variable value independence, where you represent the variables and their values independently, such that the variable is bound to one value and the variable is bound to a different value. The constituent of that complex representation that corresponds to the variable will have the same, will be the same in both representations. The thing about subspaces that attention heads work with is that in the limits, in the ideal cases, they can be perfectly separated and independent. But in practice, we know that's rarely the case. There might be some interference. I mean, this is a synthetic setup, so there might be more room for clean separation. But especially in a real-world language model, it's much messier. So that probably doesn't give you role filler independence. It's more like role filler independence in the systems is graded. It's a matter of degrees. It's not absolute. And that's a hard no from a classical perspective. At least for some people like neo-Florians like Jack Walterdon and others. But we could talk about this more. It's a complicated question.
I wanted to ask about the hypothesis space and SGD. So I guess the way I'm thinking of the hypothesis space is like the set of all possible weights that your model could take on. And so if you did a bunch of different training runs with random seeds, maybe they would all get perfect accuracy, maybe they would all show the same sequence of generalizations, but they'd all end up in really different places in the hypothesis space. But clearly there's some similarity between two different sets of weights that have exactly the same input-output behavior. So that's, I guess, one part of what I'm curious about. But then also you have this really interesting rocking pattern. We get this very sudden shift from one hypothesis to another. And so that seems to sort of imply that there's a very short continuous path from one set of weights that has a really specific and set of input and output behaviors to this other hypothesis, which seem like very computationally different hypotheses. So how, like, is it surprising to you, or are you okay with, do you have an idea of how you can get, why the hypothesis space looks like this, and how that stochastic gradient descent can work can give this result?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So first point, I think it would be fantastic to do experiments with different random seeds, and now that we have the whole experimental setup, just do the same thing and figure out whether something different happens. Anecdotally, we did early on when we were like doing some hyperparameter tuning. It was not like apple to apple because we tried different hyperparameters, but we did see like a similar pattern. It's just that, for example, when you don't have enough layers, we tried like even smaller transformers. You don't get to like perfect generalization. You make 90% of something. But similar grokking pattern, two-step. So, I don't know. The other thing is that this shows you patching success at interesting tokens positions, and you see this rapid emergence of the general mechanism. But you could look at the logit difference instead of patching success, and that probably would give you a more gradual story. So that one way to think about what you're talking about in your second point is that under the hood, maybe there are some shifts that are happening earlier that just don't have an effect on behavior right away. And it's only like when it passes a certain threshold that suddenly it starts to solve more and more programs until like it solves everything. But yeah, it'd be interesting to look more into that. I guess I'm out of time.
Yeah, I think we need to draw this to an end, but thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.